The air inside Jebediah Stone's cabin was a familiar brew of stale coffee and unwashed wool, a scent as perpetual as the dance of dust motes in the thin shafts of sunlight. He slumped over a crude table, one gnarled hand tracing the frayed edge of a newspaper scrap. The paper, brittle from years and countless rereadings, advertised a life he hadn't considered in decades. Lonely hearts seeking companionship, mail-order brides for the discerning Western man. The cheerful promises felt like a cruel jest, a sharp contrast to the hollow ache in his chest. Outside, the wind, a tireless sculptor of the high plains, hymned its ancient ballads around the cabin's weathered logs. Its mournful chorus had been his sole companion for too long, an echo of the profound silence that had descended when fever claimed Martha and little Billy. Their laughter, once the brightest sound on the ranch, was replaced by the creak of floorboards beneath his solitary weight, the rhythmic thump of his own heart, a relentless drumbeat marking an empty existence. He recalled Martha, her hair threaded with wildflowers, eyes luminous with a love he'd taken for granted. He remembered Billy's small, trusting hand in his, the boys' excited chatter about a calf they'd soon brand. These memories, vivid and piercing, were both solace and torment, proof of an irreplaceable loss. He'd tried to fill the chasm with work, with whiskey, with the endless, back-breaking routine of ranching, but nothing had ever blunted the raw edge of his grief. It was an unhealing wound, festering beneath a hardened exterior. Jeb shifted, the worn leather of his vest groaning. He'd lived alone so long, grown so accustomed to the desolate quiet, that the thought of another person sharing this space felt alien, almost sacrilegious. He was a man forged from rough edges and grunts, a creature of entrenched habit and isolation. What woman would tolerate such a life? What woman would choose it? The very idea was preposterous, yet... His gaze drifted back to the advertisement. A faded, smudged illustration depicted a woman with a soft smile and kind eyes. A deception, most likely. A fanciful sketch designed to ensnare desperate men like him. Still, a faint flicker, a desperate spark ignited within him. Not quite hope, no. More a grudging acknowledgement that change was inevitable, that he couldn't simply ride out his remaining days in self-imposed exile, submerged in the ghosts of his past. He reached for a stubby pencil and a crumpled piece of paper, salvaged from an old feed sack. His hand, calloused and stiff, felt clumsy as he struggled to form the letters. He hadn't penned a proper letter in years, not since Martha had written to her sister back east. Each word was a struggle, a battle against years of silence and emotional atrophy. "To whom it may concern," he began, his brow furrowed in concentration. The formality felt stilted, unnatural. He scratched it out. He chewed the end of the pencil, wood splintering between his teeth. How did one even begin to ask for a wife, a companion, a sliver of warmth in a life that had grown cold? He wasn't seeking love, not anymore. That well had run dry with Martha's passing. What he yearned for was something less grand, less terrifying. A presence, a sound in the house that wasn't the wind. A reason to glimpse beyond the next sunrise. "I am a rancher," he wrote, the words emerging slowly, laboriously. 52 years old. My ranch is small but steady. I need a woman who is strong and can cook and ain't afraid of hard work. He paused, grimacing at the bluntness. It sounded less like a plea for a wife and more like an ad for a hired hand. He considered adding something about his character, about the man he truly was beneath the weathered exterior, but the words wouldn't come. He was who he was. If a woman couldn't see past the gruffness, she wasn't the woman for him anyway. He was too old, too tired to pretend. He reread the sparse lines, a faint flush creeping up his neck. It was a pitiful offering, a testament to his inability to articulate the vast, echoing emptiness inside him. But it was all he had. He folded the paper carefully, his movements deliberate. From a small leather pouch tucked deep within his vest, he extracted a handful of silver coins. They gleamed dully in the cabin's dim light, a tangible representation of the desperation that had driven him to this point. He sealed the letter with a drop of melted wax, pressing his thumb into it, leaving a rough, distinctive print. It was done. The decision, once a distant, unthinkable notion, was now a concrete act. He would ride into town at first light, drop the letter and payment at the post office, and send it into the vast, uncertain expanse of the world. As he extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness, the silence felt heavier, pregnant with an unknown future. He lay on his cot, staring up at the shadowed ceiling. The scent of the dusty cabin now mingled with the faint metallic tang of the coins he'd sent away. He had cast a line into the deep, murky waters of chance, not knowing what, if anything, he would reel in. He only knew that the alternative, another day, another year of endless, solitary quiet, was a fate he could no longer bear. A wildflower in the desert. The rumble of an approaching stagecoach was an alien sound in the desolate canyon. Jebediah Stone, leaning against the weathered porch post of his equally weathered cabin, watched the cloud of dust resolve into the ornate crimson and gold vehicle. It seemed impossibly out of place, a gilded cage against the raw, uncompromising landscape. He spat a stream of tobacco juice, the acrid taste doing little to settle the nervous flutter in his gut. This was it. The woman. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, its suspension groaning. The driver, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, hopped down and opened the door with a flourish. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small, gloved hand appeared, followed by a woman's foot, encased in a sensible but surprisingly delicate boot. Finally, Clara Bellwether emerged, a splash of vibrant color in her moss-green traveling dress and matching bonnet. She seemed to shimmer in the harsh afternoon light, a wildflower blooming inexplicably in the desert. Her gaze swept over the dusty yard, the skeletal remains of a wagon, the leaning fences, and finally settled on Jeb. His face, usually a mask of indifference, tightened further. He watched her, a nod of apprehension and something he refused to name, a flicker of curiosity twisting in his chest. She was smaller than he'd imagined, more refined, and her eyes, the color of warm honey, held a startling depth. They met his, not flinching from his gruff appearance, but seeming to look through it, straight to the raw nerve beneath. He pushed himself off the post, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You must be the woman." His voice was a low growl meant to intimidate. Clara simply smiled, a soft, almost wistful expression that softened the sharp angles of her face. "And you, I presume, are Mr. Stone." Her voice was clear, melodic, utterly unfazed by his curtness. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Jeb grunted, shifting his weight. "Pleasure's all yours, I reckon." He gestured vaguely towards the cabin. "Place ain't much. Hope you ain't expecting no frills." He tried to inject a note of dismissiveness, a warning that this was no place for a delicate lady. She took a slow, appraising look at the cabin, then back at him. "I expect a home, Mr. Stone, and a man of honor." Her words were gentle, yet they carried the weight of an unspoken challenge. The driver, having retrieved her single, modest trunk, set it down with a thud. "That'll be all, ma'am. Godspeed." He tipped his hat and climbed back onto his perch, the stagecoach rumbling away, leaving a silence that felt suddenly vast and heavy. Clara turned her full attention to Jeb. "Shall we then?" she prompted, indicating the cabin. He led the way, feeling oddly clumsy under her unwavering gaze. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he'd left it, or rather, hadn't. A thin layer of dust coated every surface. Pots and pans lay scattered near the cold hearth, and a general air of neglect hung heavy. The scent of stale pipe tobacco and loneliness permeated the air. He braced himself for a gasp, a look of dismay, perhaps even a tearful retreat. Instead, Clara simply walked in, her footsteps surprisingly light. She looked around, her eyes taking in the chaos with an almost clinical detachment. Then, a slow, sad smile touched her lips. "It has potential," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She set her bonnet on a dusty table, revealing a cascade of soft brown hair, and then, without another word, she rolled up the sleeves of her dress. Jeb watched, dumbfounded, as she picked up a discarded rag from a chair and began to systematically wipe down the table. The small, almost insignificant action was a direct challenge to his entrenched slovenliness, a quiet rebellion against his carefully constructed chaos. "What in tarnation are you doing?" he finally managed, his voice rough. She paused, turning to him, her honey eyes sparkling. "I'm making a start, Mr. Stone. A home cannot be built on dust and disarray, any more than a life can be built on bitterness." Her words, though softly spoken, resonated with an undeniable force. She didn't raise her voice, didn't preach, but her meaning was as clear as the high desert sky. He felt a flush creep up his neck. He wanted to tell her to stop, to leave it be, to understand that this was his mess, his life, and she had no business trying to clean it up. But the words caught in his throat. There was something in her quiet determination, a strength that belied her delicate appearance, that held him captive. She moved from the table to the hearth, gathering the cold ashes with an almost reverent care. "A fire needs a clean bed to burn brightly," she observed, her back to him. Jeb stood rooted to the spot, watching her transform his neglected space, one small, deliberate action at a time. He had expected a complaint, an argument, a retreat. He hadn't expected a woman who simply, quietly, began to mend what he had allowed to break. It was more unsettling than any fight could have been. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the soft rustle of her movements, the gentle clink of ceramic as she straightened a forgotten mug. And in that silence, a seed of something new, something he hadn't felt in years, began to stir in the barren landscape of his heart. Echoes of the past. The scent of pine cleaner, alien and sharp, warred with the familiar dusty air of Jeb's cabin. Clara, undeterred by the film of grime on every surface, had tackled the shelves first. Her movements were precise, methodical, each swipe of her rag stripping away years of neglect. Jeb, perched on his stool by the hearth, watched her from under the brim of his hat, a silent, brooding sentinel. He feigned interest in the dying embers, but his peripheral vision tracked her every motion. She reached the top shelf, a perilous climb on a rickety chair, and stretched, her slender fingers brushing against a forgotten cigar box. It tumbled, clattering to the floor, spilling its contents. A cascade of yellowed newspaper clippings, a tarnished silver pocket watch, and a small, leather-bound photo album scattered across the rough-hewn planks. Clara knelt, gathering the items with a quiet reverence. Her fingers paused on the album, its cover faded and cracked. She opened it gently, revealing a single, sepia-toned photograph tucked into a corner slot. It depicted a younger Jeb, his face unlined by hardship, a genuine smile softening his rugged features. His arm was wrapped around a woman whose eyes sparkled with laughter, her hair a cascade of dark curls. Nestled between them, a tow-headed child no older than 4 grinned toothlessly, a tiny hand clutching Jeb's worn shirt. A strange, almost forgotten ache bloomed in Jeb's chest. He hadn't looked at that photograph in years, had deliberately buried it beneath layers of bitterness and solitude. The image was a punch to the gut, a vivid echo of a life he'd lost. "Jebediah?" Clara's voice was soft, hesitant, pulling him from the sudden chokehold of memory. She held the photo out, her brow furrowed with a gentle curiosity. "Who are these people?" The sound of her voice, the sight of the picture in her hands, felt like an invasion. His carefully constructed walls, fortified over years, threatened to crumble. A raw, unreasoning anger surged through him, a desperate attempt to push back the encroaching grief. He snapped, the words rough and gravelly. "None of your damn business, woman. Put that back." Clara flinched, her eyes widening slightly, but she didn't drop the photograph. Instead, she held his gaze, a quiet determination radiating from her. "They look like family, Jebediah." "I said put it back." He pushed himself off the stool, the sudden movement rattling the floorboards. His voice was a low growl, laced with a pain he couldn't hide. He advanced on her, his shadow falling over her small form. "You got no right digging through my things. You got no right asking questions." She slowly lowered the photo, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering, even as he loomed over her. "I apologize if I overstepped, Jebediah, but it seems you're holding on to a great deal of sorrow." Her quiet observation, so devoid of judgment, only fueled his fury. He wanted her gone, wanted the cabin to return to its silent, dusty tomb. He wanted the memories to recede back into the darkness from which they'd been dragged. "Get out. Get out of my sight." He gestured wildly towards the door, his face a mask of tormented rage. "Go on, back to wherever you came from. This ain't your home." Clara slowly rose, gathering the scattered items from the floor. She placed the cigar box back on the shelf, the photo album tucked inside, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She met his angry gaze one last time, a flicker of something akin to pity in her eyes, before turning and walking towards the cabin door. Jeb watched her go, a knot tightening in his stomach. He expected her to leave, to finally give up and disappear down the canyon road. He half hoped she would. But then, she stopped just outside the threshold, a small, worn trowel appearing in her hand. She knelt, not to gather her bags, but to sift through the hard-packed earth near the cabin's foundation. He watched, dumbfounded, as she began to turn the soil, breaking up the dry, unforgiving ground. She worked with a quiet tenacity, her movements rhythmic, almost meditative. He saw her pull a small cloth bag from her pocket, the faint rustle of seeds audible even from inside. Then she began to plant, tiny flecks of green promise pushed into the unyielding dirt. Clara Bellwether, the woman he'd ordered, the woman he'd tried to scare off, was cultivating a garden. Right there in the barren, forgotten patch of land outside his cabin. It was a defiant act, a quiet rebellion against the desolation he had embraced. A symbol of new life stubbornly pushing through the hardened earth, much like the memories she had unwittingly unearthed in his heart. The scent of fresh-turned earth, mingling with the lingering pine cleaner, began to drift through the open doorway, a subtle, unwelcome invitation. Shadows on the horizon. The sun, a fiery orb sinking towards the western rim of the canyon, cast long, distorted shadows that danced and stretched across the parched earth. A faint, rhythmic thudding disrupted the evening's growing quiet. The unmistakable cadence of horses on the dusty trail. Jeb, perched on the cabin's rickety porch, whittling a piece of cedar into an unrecognizable bird, felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't the sound itself, but the nature of it. Too many hooves for a lone rider, too deliberate for wild mustangs. He didn't look up immediately, his calloused thumb stroking the rough wood. Clara was bent over her nascent garden patch, humming a tuneless melody, her back to the approaching sound. The vibrant green shoots, barely a day old, seemed to pulse with defiant life against the stark landscape. Jeb's gaze, though seemingly fixed on his carving, flickered to her, then back to the trail. 3 riders emerged from the purple haze of twilight, silhouetted against the dying light. They weren't travelers. Their dust-caked coats hung heavy with the weight of unseen weapons, and their hats, pulled low, hid most of their faces, but not the glint in their eyes. The lead rider, a wiry man with a cruel twist to his mouth, had eyes that seemed to glow with an unsettling yellow light, earning him his infamous moniker, Silas Snake-Eye Blackwood. To his left, a hulking brute with a scarred cheek rode silent and menacing. On his right, a younger, fidgety man, Little Johnny, clutched the reins of his pony with white knuckles, his gaze darting nervously. They slowed as they neared the cabin, their horses kicking up plumes of red dust that hung in the still air. Snake-Eye's head turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the property, lingering on the freshly turned earth of Clara's garden, then settling on Clara herself. He didn't speak, but the leer that spread across his face was a language all its own. Clara, straightening up from her work, felt the weight of his stare. Her hum died in her throat. Jeb's knuckles, tight around his whittling knife, blanched white. A raw, unfamiliar sensation tightened his chest, a protective urge he hadn't felt in years, a fierce, almost forgotten spark of guardianship. It was like a rusty lock grinding open in his soul. He'd lived for so long in a self-imposed vacuum of apathy, believing he had nothing left to lose, nothing left to defend. But the sight of that predatory gaze on Clara ignited something primal within him. Snake Eye offered a slow, derisive smile, revealing teeth stained yellow. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness, his eyes never leaving Clara. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to scrape against the silence. "Looks like someone's found themselves a pretty little flower out here in the thorns." Clara, despite a tremor that ran through her, met his gaze with an unwavering stare. She didn't flinch, didn't cower. Jeb saw it, and a flicker of admiration, unwelcome but undeniable, sparked in his eyes. Little Johnny, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his eyes wide as he glanced from Snake Eye to Jeb, who remained motionless on the porch, a silent, unmoving sentinel. The air thickened with unspoken tension. "Just passing through," Snake Eye finally said, though his tone suggested anything but. He flicked his gaze to Jeb, a challenge in his yellow eyes. "Wouldn't want to disturb your domestic bliss." He emphasized the last two words with a sneer, then, with a sharp tug on his reins, spurred his horse forward, the other two following close behind. The thudding receded, swallowed by the vastness of the canyon, but the shadows they left behind felt colder, more substantial. Jeb watched them disappear over the rise, his grip still tight on the knife. The protective surge didn't dissipate, it lingered, a low thrum beneath his ribs, foreign and unsettling. Clara turned slowly, her heart still thumping against her ribs, and saw Jeb watching her. His usual stony mask was subtly altered. A vulnerability, fleeting but undeniable, played around the edges of his eyes, a raw concern he usually kept buried. She walked towards him, her steps slow and deliberate, the dust puffing softly around her worn boots. She stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her. "They were unpleasant," she stated, her voice steady despite the lingering fear. Jeb grunted, a non-committal sound, and returned his attention to his carving, though his movements were stiff, his focus clearly elsewhere. The bird remained unfinished, its wing oddly angled. "You don't have to be alone, Jebediah," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a surprising conviction. The words hung in the air between them, challenging the very foundation of his carefully constructed solitude. "Or angry." He flinched, a subtle tightening of his jaw. Her words, like tiny, insistent hammers, chipped away at the walls he built around himself. He didn't look at her, but she saw the slight tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders tensed. He wanted to lash out, to drive her away with a harsh word, to retreat back into the safe, numb anger he'd cultivated for so long. But the image of Snake Eye's leering face, the memory of that cold, possessive gaze on Clara, held his tongue. He said nothing, just continued to carve, the sharp scrape of the knife against wood the only sound. But Clara knew. She'd seen the flicker in his eyes, felt the subtle shift in the air. The wall hadn't crumbled, but a new crack had appeared, thin as a whisper, but undeniably there. And she, with her stubborn hope and quiet strength, would keep pressing against it. The tension from the previous day's encounter with Snake Eye still clung to the air, a phantom chill that even the morning sun couldn't quite dispel. Jeb, however, retreated into his usual stoicism, burying the flicker of protectiveness beneath layers of gruff silence. He chopped wood with a ferocity that spoke of internal battles, each swing of the axe a deliberate act of emotional suppression. Clara, sensing his retreat, moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, her presence a soft counterpoint to his harsh rhythm. She was organizing a dusty corner of what Jeb vaguely remembered as the keeping room, a place where his wife, Sarah, had once kept her sewing basket and the children's worn toys. A faint smile, almost a ghost of a memory, tugged at the corner of his mouth. He recalled a sunny afternoon, Sarah humming a lullaby as she mended a tear in their son's overalls, the scent of lavender and freshly baked bread filling the small room. Their daughter, Lily, a tangle of bright curls and boundless energy, had been attempting to help by handing Sarah pins, often pricking her own small fingers in the process, only to be soothed by a gentle kiss and a whispered story. The memory, a delicate butterfly, fluttered against the iron cage of his grief, a warmth spreading through him before the familiar ache of loss asserted itself, a cold hand squeezing his heart. Clara, humming a tune Jeb didn't recognize but found strangely comforting, knelt beside a weathered chest. She pulled out an assortment of forgotten trinkets, a chipped porcelain doll, a child's worn wooden horse, a collection of smooth river stones. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic nestled amongst the debris. She picked it up, a small silver locket, tarnished with age and neglect. It was broken at the hinge, its delicate chain snapped. With careful effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside, two faded, sepia-toned photographs stared back at her. One picture showed a woman, her smile gentle, her eyes radiating warmth and kindness. Jeb's Sarah. The other, a small child, a girl with bright, inquisitive eyes and a mischievous grin. Lily. Clara held the locket gently, her thumb tracing the faint outline of the faces. She looked up, her gaze soft, expectant, meeting Jeb's across the room. He had stopped chopping, his axe resting against the block, his eyes fixed on the locket in her hand. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him, a surge of anger at her intrusion, a pang of longing for what was lost, and a strange, unfamiliar vulnerability. "They're beautiful," Clara said, her voice a hushed whisper, respectful of the fragile memories the locket contained. She didn't press, didn't demand. She simply held it out, an offering. Jeb walked slowly towards her, each step heavy with the weight of years. He took the locket from her, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they clutched the cold metal. He stared at the images, his own face a mask of stone, yet his eyes, usually so guarded, held a distant, profound sadness. "Who were they, Jebediah?" Clara's voice was barely audible, a gentle breeze stirring the dust in the quiet room. She didn't look away, her gaze unwavering, not accusatory, but deeply empathetic. Jeb flinched, as if physically struck. The words were a key, turning in a lock he had kept sealed for a decade. He turned away, his back to her, the locket clutched tight in his hand. "None of your concern," he grunted, the words harsh, a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls she was so painstakingly dismantling. But Clara wasn't deterred. She rose, moving to stand beside him, not touching him, but her presence a warm, unyielding force. "Everyone has a past, Jebediah," she said, her voice calm, steady. "And sometimes, speaking of it, even the painful parts can lighten the burden." He remained silent, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched. The scent of pine and dust mingled with the faint, sweet aroma, of the dried flowers Clara had placed on the windowsill. He could almost hear Sarah's laugh, Lily's excited chatter. The memories, once locked away in a dark vault, were now swirling around him, vivid and alive, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. The warmth they brought was quickly followed by an icy grip of sorrow, tightening its hold. "Was that your wife?" Clara continued, her voice still gentle. "And your daughter?" Jeb let out a ragged breath, a sound that was more a gasp than a sigh. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the images, the pain. He opened them again, turning to face her, his eyes raw, haunted. "They're gone," he said, his voice raspy, a whisper torn from the depths of his soul. It was the first time he had ever spoken of them, the first crack in the impenetrable fortress of his grief. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sorrow, a fragile bridge between their two worlds. Clara simply nodded, her eyes filled with a profound understanding, a silent promise of steadfast presence. The locket, still clutched in his hand, seemed to throb with the resonance of a life once lived, a love once cherished, now a wound barely beginning to heal. The weight of blame. The locket, a small, burnished brass oval, rested between them on the scarred tabletop, a silent testament to a life Jebediah Stone had meticulously interred. His face, typically a craggy mask, now appeared ravaged by raw pain. The lines around his eyes deepened, his jaw clenched with furious energy. He recoiled from the table, his chair shrieking against the rough-hewn floorboards, the sound a ragged tear in the sudden quiet. "You shouldn't have touched that," he snarled, his voice thick with a venom intended to repulse her, to restore the formidable barriers she had so easily breached. He snatched the locket, his fingers engulfing it as if to pulverize the memories it held, then plunged it deep into his worn trousers pocket. His gaze, usually evasive, now burned into hers, a desperate plea for her withdrawal, for her to abandon him to his self-imposed solitude. Clara, however, stood her ground. She watched him, her eyes unwavering, a quiet strength radiating from her that seemed to absorb his fury without echo. The flickering lamplight elongated shadows across the cabin, making the familiar space feel suddenly intimate, charged with unvoiced truths. "Jebediah," she began, her voice soft yet firm, a stark counterpoint to his harsh outburst. "You don't have to bear this alone." He issued a bitter laugh, a sound utterly devoid of mirth. "Alone? I've been alone. It's the way it is." He began to pace the small cabin, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, a restless energy emanating from him. "They're gone, Clara. My Sarah, my Lily, both of them, vanished." The words were torn from him, ragged and raw, each syllable a shard of glass. "Fever. Took them both within a week. And I couldn't do anything. I wasn't enough. Not fast enough, smart enough, strong enough to save them." His voice fractured on the last word, dissolving into a strangled gasp of despair. He slammed his fist against the wall, the impact rattling a small framed picture of a distant mountain range. Clara rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't rush him, didn't attempt physical restraint or empty solace. Instead, she simply moved, seating herself on the edge of the cot, close enough for him to perceive her presence, the quiet warmth of her understanding. The air in the cabin, thick with dust and the scent of wood smoke, now seemed to thrum with his grief. He turned, his eyes bloodshot, wild with a pain he had relentlessly suppressed. "I failed them," he choked out, the admission of visceral wrenching from his soul. "I brought them out here, to this God-forsaken place, believing I could forge a life for them, and I let them die. It's my fault. All of it." His voice dwindled to a raw whisper now, the earlier anger supplanted by a crushing self-condemnation. He sagged against the rough-hewn table, his shoulders slumped, the weight of years of unspoken blame pressing him down. Clara reached out, her hand hovering a moment before gently settling on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, yet he didn't pull away. The contact was a spark, a tiny ember in the desolate landscape of his grief. "No, Jebediah," she murmured, her voice a balm against his wounded spirit. "You loved them. That much is clear. Sometimes the world takes what it wants, no matter how fiercely we fight. It's not a reflection of your worth or your love." Her gaze was steady, compassionate, seeing past the gruff exterior to the broken man beneath. "You've carried this burden for too long. You've punished yourself for something that wasn't your fault." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any hint of pity or judgment, finding only profound empathy. The raw emotion in his face was startling, a stark contrast to the stoicism she had grown to expect. A single tear, hot and heavy, tracked a path down his weathered cheek, the first she had ever witnessed him shed. "What's the point, Clara?" he asked, his voice barely audible, thick with despair. "There's nothing left. No future. Just this." He gestured vaguely around the cabin, at the sparse, utilitarian existence he had carved out for himself. She squeezed his arm gently. "The point, Jebediah," she began, her voice imbued with a quiet strength, "is that you are still here, and they would have wanted you to live, to find some peace, some happiness. You deserve that, Jebediah. You deserve a chance to be happy again." The words hung in the air, a fragile offering in the desolate space. He stared at her, the idea so alien, so foreign to his self-inflicted penance that it seemed almost impossible. But in her unwavering gaze, in the steady warmth of her hand on his arm, a minuscule flicker of hope, hesitant and vulnerable, dared to ignite within the ashes of his grief. It was a terrifying prospect, this idea of a future, but for the first time in years, the crushing weight of his blame felt fractionally lighter. The outlaw's return. The lingering scent of pine and wood smoke, a fragile comfort, seemed to mock the raw ache in Jebediah's chest. Clara, a whirlwind of motion, had retreated to the small kitchen, her clattering pots a sharp counterpoint to the profound silence that had long dominated their lives. From the doorway, he observed her quiet efficiency, a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. The locket, a cold weight in his palm, served as a stark, metallic reminder of the conversation that had just pried open old wounds. Still reeling, the jagged edges of his grief exposed, his thoughts were abruptly shattered by a clamor from the yard. Old Blue, typically a tranquil sentinel, was now barking with furious insistence. Jeb's hand instinctively sought the worn grip of the rifle against the wall, a shiver of disquiet tracing a path up his spine. This wasn't the distant howl of a coyote or the snort of a foraging deer. This was a distinct kind of alarm, igniting a flash of grim recognition within him. He moved to the window, peering through the grimy pane. 4 horsemen, kicking up plumes of dust, were fast approaching the cabin. Their silhouettes, starkly defined by the late afternoon sun, belonged unmistakably to the outlaws who had haunted his past. Silas, with that cruel, lopsided grin, rode point, his elongated shadow stretching menacingly across the parched earth. Behind him, little Johnny fidgeted in his saddle, his eyes skittering nervously across the familiar terrain. "They're back," Jeb murmured, the words a gritty whisper. Clara materialized beside him, her brow creased with worry. "Who?" "Trouble," he grunted, his gaze riveted on the approaching riders. "Snake-Eye Blackwood and his crew." And before he could elaborate, Silas's booming voice fractured the stillness. "Well, well, if it ain't the hermit and his new plaything. Look what the cat dragged in, boys." A wave of coarse laughter followed, echoing off the canyon walls. Cold dread washed over Jeb, but beneath it, a spark, long dormant, flickered to life. He saw Clara's eyes, wide with a fear she valiantly tried to conceal, and a protective instinct, deep-seated and fierce, roared into being. He stepped in front of her, his rifle now cradled loosely, its barrel canted toward the floor, a subtle yet unwavering shield. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry soil, and sauntered toward the porch. His eyes, like chips of flint, scoured Jeb, then lingered on Clara with an unsettling leer. "Heard you finally got yourself a woman, Stone. Didn't think you had it in you." Jeb's jaw clenched. "What do you want, Silas?" His voice, though rough, held a surprising steadiness. "What do I want?" Silas chuckled, a parched, rasping sound. "Well, a man gets peckish on the trail, doesn't he? And thirsty, and a place to rest his weary bones. Your hospitality, Stone, that's what I crave." He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "And don't think of being stingy. We'll be taking what we need." Little Johnny shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Silas and Jeb. "Silas, maybe we should just grab some grub and go." Silas shot him a venomous glare. "Shut your trap, Johnny. This ain't your say." He turned back to Jeb, a predatory glint in his eye. "Now, are you going to invite us in, or are we going to have to make ourselves at home?" Jeb felt the familiar tremor of fear in his hands, but forced it down. He glanced back at Clara. Her chin was held high, her eyes fixed on Silas with a defiant glint. He would not let them touch her. He would not let them mar the fragile peace she had brought. "You ain't welcome here, Silas," Jeb said, his voice low and guttural. Slowly, he raised the rifle, its worn wood cool against his palm, the barrel now aimed squarely at Silas's chest. It was an act of defiance he hadn't known he still possessed. A sudden hush fell over the yard, broken only by the wind whispering through the dry grasses and the horses' nervous snorts. Silas's sneer evaporated, replaced first by surprise, then by a chilling fury. His hand instinctively gravitated to the pistol at his hip. "You got a mighty big mouth for a man who lives alone in the middle of nowhere, Stone," Silas snarled, his voice stripped of its playful edge. "Think you can stand up to me?" Jeb didn't falter. He met Silas's gaze, unflinching. The locket in his pocket felt like a brand, a searing reminder of what he had lost, and what he now fiercely had to protect. "You ain't getting in this house." Little Johnny gulped, his eyes wide. The other outlaws exchanged uneasy glances. The air crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. This was not the broken, cowed man they remembered. This was a different Jebediah Stone. And for the first time in a long time, Silas Blackwood looked genuinely taken aback. The standoff had begun. A cowboy's resolve. The rifle felt alien in Jebediah's hands, a forgotten extension of a life he'd actively buried. Yet, as Silas Blackwood's sneering face sharpened in his sight, a muscle memory stirred. He didn't lower the weapon, even as the outlaw's dark eyes narrowed, shifting from Clara's frightened form to the unwavering barrel pointed at his chest. "Well, well, well," Silas drawled, a slow smile spreading, revealing stained teeth. "Look what the cat dragged in. A hero, are we now, Stone?" "Thought you'd lost your taste for trouble." Jebediah remained silent, his jaw tight. He could feel Clara's terrified gaze on his back, a burning weight that fueled a cold resolve he hadn't known he still possessed. Little Johnny, fidgeting beside Silas, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should just move on, Silas. Ain't worth the bother." Silas's gaze snapped to Little Johnny, a flash of irritation in his eyes before he turned back to Jebediah. "Bother? This ain't bother, boy. This is a reunion. And old Jeb here, he ain't in a position to be turning down company." He took a step forward, a predatory glint in his eye. Jebediah, despite the tremor in his hands, didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled back the hammer with a sharp click that echoed in the sudden silence. It was a sound that had once preceded justice, or desperation, in countless dusty towns. He remembered the weight of the rifle, the precise angle of his shoulder, the steadying breath. "You're not welcome here." Jebediah's voice was a low growl, rough with disuse, but infused with a surprising authority. "Turn around." Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Or what, old man? You gonna shoot us all?" Jebediah didn't answer. Instead, with a practiced, fluid motion that belied his years of idleness, he lifted the rifle slightly, aimed just past Silas's head, and fired. The shot cracked through the canyon air, a deafening report that sent a flock of startled birds spiraling from the cliff face above. A puff of dust erupted from the rock behind Silas, a clear message of Jebediah's accuracy and intent. Silas flinched, his bravado momentarily shattered. His eyes widened, scanning the small plume of dust, then snapping back to Jebediah, a flicker of genuine surprise replacing his cruel amusement. Little Johnny yelped, stumbling backward. "He ain't fooling, Silas," Little Johnny stammered, his face pale. "He means it." The silence that followed was thick with tension, punctuated only by the distant cries of the disrupted birds. Jebediah stood firm, the rifle still raised, his eyes fixed on Silas. He felt a tremor deep within him, a residual shock from the sudden explosion of sound, but he held his stance. Silas's gaze darted between Jebediah and the still smoking rock. The cruel glint returned, but it was tempered by caution. He was a man who understood threats, and Jebediah had just delivered a potent one. "All right, Stone," he finally snarled, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "You made your point. For now." He spat on the ground. "But this ain't over. We'll be back." With a final, venomous glare, Silas turned, grabbing Little Johnny by the arm and roughly pulling him along. The outlaws mounted their horses, the sound of hooves slowly fading into the vast quiet of the canyon. Jebediah didn't lower the rifle until the last echo of their departure had vanished. When he did, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, and a wave of exhaustion washed over him, leaving him feeling hollowed out. He leaned against the door frame, the rifle suddenly heavy. Clara was beside him in an instant, her hand gently touching his arm. He hadn't even heard her move. "Jebediah," she whispered, her voice trembling but filled with an awe that surprised him. "You were incredible." He grunted, unable to meet her gaze. The adrenaline was draining, leaving behind a dull ache in his chest and a profound sense of vulnerability. He realized then that his cheek was bleeding, a thin line where the rifle stock had scraped him. Clara noticed it too. "You're hurt." Her touch was light as she guided him inside, pulling a clean cloth from a hook by the hearth. She dampened it with water from the bucket. "Just a small cut," she murmured, her fingers surprisingly gentle as she dabbed at the wound. Her proximity, her focused attention, was a balm he hadn't known he craved. "You were very brave, Jebediah," she said softly, her eyes meeting his, full of genuine admiration. "I was so afraid, but you stood up to them." He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. Praise was a foreign concept, especially from a woman. He'd lived so long in the shadow of his own failures, his own grief. Yet as Clara's warm fingers ministered to his face, a warmth spread through his chest, chasing away some of the coldness that had resided there for years. It wasn't the searing heat of anger or the bitter chill of sorrow, but something softer, more comforting. It was a feeling of being seen, truly seen, not as the broken man he thought himself to be, but as something more, something capable. And in that moment, as Clara's gaze held his, he realized that the old life, the one he thought he'd buried, might not be entirely gone after all. A spark, long dormant, had just flickered back to life. Story shared. The cabin air, thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and sharp pine, offered a strange solace after the raw fear that had gripped them. Jebediah remained by the window, his gaze fixed on the darkening canyon, the rifle a warm weight in his hands. The silence between them, dense with unspoken thoughts, yielded to Clara's soft inquiry. You handled that rifle well, Jebediah." Her words were not flattery, but an observation imbued with a respect he hadn't heard in years. He grunted, a non-committal rumble, his back still to her. Silas Blackwood's sneering face, the glint in the outlaw's eye, still seared his mind. He'd seen that predatory hunger before. Clara moved closer, her presence a quiet warmth behind him. "You protected us." "Just chasing off varmints," he mumbled, though the usual bitterness in his voice was muted. As the adrenaline receded, it left behind profound weariness, yet also a nascent openness. He leaned the rifle against the wall with a soft thud, a small sound that resonated in the compact space. Then, without turning, he began to speak, his voice raspy, as if unaccustomed to sharing. "My boy, he loved to shoot. Not like that, not for fighting. He'd line up pine cones on that old stump out there, try to hit 'em with his slingshot. Called himself a mighty hunter." A ghost of a smile, delicate as spun glass, flickered across his lips and vanished. Clara held her silence, her stillness an invitation, a sanctuary for his words. My wife, Ilara, she'd bake him little shortbread cookies when he hit 'em all. Said he earned 'em, working hard. He finally turned, his eyes, usually so guarded, holding a distant, wistful light. She had a laugh like wind chimes, soft and sweet. Always smelled of lavender and flower. He looked at his calloused hands, as if seeing them anew, not as tools for labor, but as hands that had once cradled a child, a wife. He was only 5 when they came. His voice hitched, the pain a raw, exposed nerve. Little Jeb. Named him after me, Ilara did. Said he'd be strong like his pa. The dam, meticulously built over years of solitary grief, had fractured. Stories flowed out, hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet momentum. He spoke of fishing trips to the creek, of building a crooked tree house, of Ilara's vibrant garden, a splash of color against the stark canyon. He described her boundless kindness, her unwavering faith, the way she could coax a song from a broken harmonica. Clara listened, her heart aching with empathy. She saw the boy in the man's eyes, the love that had been crushed, the life that had been stolen. A strange, bittersweet peace permeated his telling, a release in allowing those memories to breathe in the open air, rather than festering in the dark corners of his mind. He was no longer solely the gruff recluse. He was a man who had loved and lost profoundly. When his stories eventually tapered off, a heavy silence settled once more. But this time it was different. A comfortable quiet, imbued with shared understanding. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not pity, but steady compassion. You lost someone too, didn't you? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Clara met his gaze, a faint sadness shadowing her own eyes. My family, they passed during the cholera epidemic when I was 16. My parents, my younger sister, Lily. She was only 9. She paused, a hand unconsciously rising to the delicate silver locket she always wore, rubbing its smooth surface. I was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in the city. They were kind, but their life was not mine. I learned to sew, to cook, to manage a household, but I always felt adrift, like a bird whose nest had been swept away by a storm. Jebediah watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. He saw the quiet strength in her confession, the resilience that allowed her to navigate such profound loss and still stand before him, offering solace. He recognized a shared understanding, a kinship born of the jagged edges that grief left behind. It's not easy, carrying that weight, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. No, she agreed, a small, sad smile touching her lips. But it's lighter when you don't carry it alone. She glanced around the cabin, at the sparse furnishings, the dust motes dancing in the faint light. We build new nests, Jebediah, sometimes in the most unexpected places. His gaze lingered on her, taking in the gentle curve of her brow, the steadfastness in her eyes. The walls he'd painstakingly constructed around his heart, once breached by the threat of violence, now crumbled under the quiet power of shared grief and burgeoning trust. He felt a profound shift within him, a subtle thawing. The future, once a bleak and empty expanse, now held a faint, fragile promise. He had defended his home, and in doing so, he had begun to defend a future with her in it. Building a new future. The dawn after the ambush painted the canyon walls in hues of raw umber and rose. But for Jebediah, the light felt different, cleaner. The air, usually heavy with the dust of neglect and the unspoken weight of his sorrow, seemed to shimmer with possibility. Clara was already up, a small kettle whistling on the stovetop, the aroma of coffee cutting through the lingering scent of gunpowder and fear.
You watched her.
The quiet efficiency of her movements, the way she hummed a tuneless melody as she stirred a pot of oats. He realized, with a jolt, that he hadn't hummed in years. Later, as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the yard, Jebediah found himself with a hammer in hand, not merely for maintenance, but for repair. The sagging porch step, a hazard he'd long ignored, now seemed an affront. He replaced the rotten wood with a sturdy new plank, the rhythmic clang of the hammer against nails echoing a newfound resolve. He moved to the split-rail fence, sections of which lay in disarray, a testament to years of indifference. Each post he drove deep into the earth, each rail he secured, felt like a deliberate act of building. Not just for the ranch, but for something else, something budding within him. Clara, observing from the cabin door, offered a small, approving nod, her gaze following his tireless movements. He didn't meet her eyes, but a warmth spread through his chest, as tangible as a splinter in his thumb. The work was hard, honest, and it filled the silence that used to be so oppressive. He mended the leaky roof of the barn, patched the drafty windows of the cabin, and even cleared the overgrown path leading down to the creek, revealing a faint, almost forgotten trail. One afternoon, while clearing a particularly stubborn patch of weeds near the old, gnarled oak tree that stood sentinel over the property, his shovel struck something hard. He dug around it, unearthing a small, tarnished silver locket. It was delicate, intricately engraved with a single, faded rose. He recognized it instantly. It had belonged to his wife, Alara, a gift from him on their wedding day. The locket had been lost for years, swallowed by the earth, much like his hope. His breath hitched. He sat on the dusty ground, the locket heavy in his calloused palm. For a moment, the old pain, sharp and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm him. He saw Alara's smile, heard their son Thomas's childish laughter, a phantom echo in the canyon wind. He pictured the day they were taken from him, the smoke, the screams, the unholy silence that followed. He had blamed himself every single day for not being there, for not protecting them. The guilt had been a living thing gnawing at his insides. Clara, drawn by his sudden stillness, approached cautiously. She knelt beside him, her presence a quiet anchor. She didn't speak, merely laid a gentle hand on his arm, a silent offer of comfort. He looked at the locket, then at Clara's empathetic face. Her eyes, so open and understanding, seemed to absorb his pain without judgment. "It was hers," he rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Alara's." Clara nodded slowly. "It's beautiful, Jebediah." He traced the faded rose with his thumb. "I lost it. The day they were taken." His voice broke. I should have been here. I should have saved them. Clara squeezed his arm. Sometimes, Jebediah, there's nothing we can do, no matter how much we wish we could. The world is a cruel place sometimes, and bad things happen to good people. It doesn't make it your fault. Her words, so simple, yet so profoundly true, resonated deep within him. He had replayed that day 1,000,000 times, searching for an escape, a different choice he could have made. But there had been none. He had been miles away, driving cattle, unaware of the terror unfolding at his home. He hadn't abandoned them. He had simply been caught in the relentless machinations of fate. The blame he had carried, a crushing burden for so long, began to shift, to lighten. It didn't disappear entirely. Perhaps it never would. But it transformed into a dull ache rather than a gaping wound. He looked around the ranch, at the gnarled oak, at the rising sun, at Clara's steadfast presence. He thought of Alara and Thomas, not as ghosts of his past, but as cherished memories. He wanted to remember them with love, not with the suffocating weight of guilt. He carefully placed the locket back in the earth, not to bury his past, but to lay it to rest. Then he gathered a small pile of smooth, river-worn stones. With deliberate care, he began to arrange them at the base of the old oak, forming a small, humble cairn. It wasn't a monument of grief, but a quiet tribute, a place to remember, to honor, to feel their presence not as a burden, but as a blessing. Clara watched him, a soft smile gracing her lips. When he finished, he stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. He met her gaze, and for the first time, the raw pain in his eyes was tempered by a flicker of peace. "They would have liked you, Clara," he said, the words surprising even himself. Clara's smile widened, genuine and warm. "I think I would have liked them too, Jebediah." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon. The work wasn't finished. The ranch still needed much. But as Jebediah looked out over the land, a sense of quiet determination settled over him. He was building something new, not just a ranch, but a life. And this time, he wasn't building it alone. He had Clara, and in the quiet strength of her presence, he found the courage to face whatever lay ahead, with the past finally at peace. A promise of love. The late afternoon sun stretched fingers of shadow across the yard, burnishing the mended fence with a warm, ochreous glow. Jeb stood by the freshly turned earth of the cairn, his calloused thumb tracing the stone's rough-hewn edge. The air hung hushed, disturbed only by a distant crow's cry and the whisper of dry leaves in a languid breeze. Clara approached, a basket of crisp laundry nestled in the crook of her arm, her footsteps barely disturbing the dusty path. He turned, their eyes locking, and a silent, ineffable current passed between them. "It's peaceful now," he rasped, his voice gravelly, as if unaccustomed to such tender articulation. He gestured vaguely at the piled stones, at the quiet ranch corner that had long festered like a wound. Clara's gaze softened. "It is, Jebediah. They'd be proud." He registered an almost imperceptible flinch at the mention of his kin, the old guilt, a familiar, unbidden specter. Yet, this time, it didn't seep into his bones, didn't anchor him with its customary weight. He truly saw Clara then, beyond the practical woman who kept his home and mended his shirts. He perceived the bedrock strength, the quiet tenacity that had steadied his own aimless heart. "Clara," he began, a low growl escaping before he cleared his throat. He shifted his stance, his eyes flickering to the distant horizon, then back to her face. When I sent for you," he faltered, grappling for words that felt woefully insufficient for the seismic shift within him. "I was a desperate man, broken. I needed somebody, anyone." Clara listened, her expression unreadable, her hands, mid-fold on a shirt, now utterly still. Jeb inhaled deeply, the truth, a bitter, then strangely sweet revelation on his tongue. "I didn't know what I was doing. Didn't know what I was asking of you, or of myself." Finally, he met her gaze head-on, his own eyes stripped bare, vulnerable. "But you came, and you didn't just mend my home. You mended me." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "You saw past the bitterness, past the grief. You saw something else." A small, genuine smile blossomed on Clara's face, a rare bloom that warmed him to his core. Not the polite, guarded curve he'd grown used to, but one that reached her eyes, making them sparkle like sun-dappled spring water. "Jebediah," she said, her voice gentle yet resolute, "I saw a good man. A man who had been hurt, yes, but a man with a true heart buried deep. And I saw a man who needed someone to believe in him." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You're not the man you were when I arrived. You're whole, stronger." A tremor ran through him, a sensation he hadn't known in years. Hope. A fragile, exhilarating current. "Clara," he repeated, the word a prayer, a confession. I care for you. Not just as a wife I ordered. Not just as the woman who brings order to my chaos." He reached out, his rough hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing over her soft skin. "I love you, Clara." The words, once inconceivable, felt utterly right, natural, as if they had merely awaited this moment to be spoken. Clara's smile widened, her eyes glistening. She leaned into his touch, her hand covering his on her cheek. "And I love you, Jebediah Stone." Her voice was a soft murmur, barely audible above the growing hum of insects ushering in twilight. "I fell in love with the quiet strength I glimpsed in you, even when you tried to hide it. I fell in love with the way you protect what's yours and the way you fought to reclaim yourself." A profound warmth spread through him, chasing away the last lingering shadows of his past. He had never imagined such a feeling was possible again. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on her lips, a silent question passing between them. Clara's eyes fluttered closed, a silent invitation. His lips met hers, gently at first, a soft exploration. It wasn't a kiss born of desperation or obligation, but one steeped in shared vulnerability, in hard-won understanding, and in a burgeoning, profound affection. It was a promise of a future he had once believed utterly lost, now built on trust, on healing, and on a love that had bloomed unexpectedly in the desolate canyon. When they finally parted, their foreheads still touching, a quiet understanding settled between them, solid and unshakable. The air around them seemed to shimmer with a new kind of light, brighter than the fading sun. "Together," he murmured, the word a sacred vow. Clara smiled, a radiant, full-hearted expression that made his own heart ache with a joyful pang. "Together," she echoed, her voice full of a gentle, unwavering hope. Sunset over a new beginning. The last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples that bled into the encroaching twilight. Jebediah stood beside Clara, their silhouettes stark against the vibrant canvas, etched into the landscape as if they had always belonged there. His large, calloused hand found hers, not a tentative brush, but a firm, anchoring clasp that felt both new and profoundly familiar. It was a silent promise, an unspoken vow that resonated in the quiet expanse of the canyon. The air, which usually carried the mournful whisper of the wind through the pines, now held a different kind of hush, a peaceful reverence. The day's labor, the steady rhythm of their work together, had settled into the land around them. The once ramshackle corrals now stood sturdy, a testament to their combined efforts. The small garden plot, tilled and planted under Clara's meticulous eye, promised a bounty of green life in the coming weeks. Even the cabin, no longer a monument to neglect, radiated a warmth that reached them even from this distance. It was more than a structure, it was a home, breathing with a newfound vitality. Jebediah turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the burgeoning ranch. He saw not just the physical changes, but the invisible threads of their shared future weaving through every fence post, every turned furrow. He saw the potential, the life that would flourish here, nurtured by their hands and their growing love. The bitterness that had once coated his perception, making every sunset a reminder of what he'd lost, had finally dissolved. Now the setting sun felt like a benediction, a blessing on their new beginning. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture so natural, so unassuming, that it took his breath away. Her presence was a balm, a constant source of quiet strength that had mended him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He still wasn't a man of many words, but with Clara, he didn't need to be. Their understanding transcended spoken language, residing in the gentle squeeze of a hand, the shared glance, the comforting weight of her against him. "It's beautiful, Jebediah," she murmured, her voice a soft counterpoint to the rustling leaves. "Everything you've built, everything we're building." He grunted, a sound that to anyone else might have seemed non-committal. But Clara understood. It was his way of acknowledging, of agreeing, of expressing a depth of emotion that few had ever witnessed. He tightened his grip on her hand, drawing her a fraction closer. The rough fabric of his work shirt felt solid beneath her cheek, a comforting anchor. "It ain't much yet," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of its usual gruff edge. "But it'll be enough." Clara smiled, a radiant warmth that illuminated her face even in the fading light. "It's already more than enough. It's home. And it's ours." The word "ours" hung in the air, a melody that resonated deep within Jebediah's soul. He'd spent so long thinking in terms of mine, of ownership and solitary burden. Now, there was a partner, an equal, a woman who saw past his hardened exterior to the man he truly was, and loved him for it. He thought of the long, lonely years, the haunting images that had plagued his sleep, the crushing weight of grief and guilt that had been his constant companions. He thought of the desperate gamble of ordering a bride, a last-ditch effort to bring some semblance of order to his desolate existence. And then, Clara had arrived, a quiet storm that had swept through his life, clearing away the debris of his past and planting the seeds of a future he hadn't dared to dream of. He remembered her unwavering resolve, her steady hands, her unwavering belief in him even when he had doubted himself most. She hadn't just tidied his cabin. She had reordered his entire world. She had shown him that love wasn't just a memory, a ghost of what had been, but a living, breathing force that could heal and transform. A lone coyote howled in the distance, a mournful sound that was quickly answered by another. But tonight, it didn't feel like a lament. It felt like a part of the wild, untamed world they were making their own. Jebediah felt a fierce, protective surge in his chest. This land, this woman, this life, they were his to cherish and defend. He looked down at Clara, her profile soft in the twilight, a sense of profound peace emanating from her. Her presence had not just quieted the demons within him, it had replaced them with a quiet joy, a steady contentment he hadn't thought possible. He saw the strength in her gentle demeanor, the resilience in her quiet determination. She was everything he hadn't known he needed, and everything he now couldn't imagine living without. "We'll make it grow," he said, his voice rough with emotion, but clear. "This ranch, our life." Clara tilted her head back, meeting his gaze. Her eyes, pools of deep brown, held a depth of love and understanding that mirrored his own. "Together," she affirmed, her voice a soft promise. He nodded, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, chasing away the shadows that had lingered there for too long. The last vestiges of the sunset faded, leaving behind a sky dusted with the first pinpricks of stars. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. But inside, a new warmth had kindled, a quiet fire that promised to burn brightly. With their hands clasped, their shoulders touching, Jebediah Stone and Clara Bellwether stood together on the edge of their ranch, on the cusp of a new beginning. The past was behind them, buried and honored. The future stretched out before them, vast and full of possibility, waiting to be shaped by their shared dreams and unwavering love. They were no longer two solitary souls, but a single, unbreakable unit, ready to face whatever the world might bring. Together. He squeezed her hand once more, a silent reaffirmation of his commitment, his love. She squeezed back, her touch a delicate echo of his strength. The stars above them began to multiply, glittering like scattered diamonds on a velvet cloth, bearing silent witness to their quiet, profound pledge. The ranch, their home, slept around them, waiting for the dawn and for the promise of a brand new day.